new there. Let's see. What do we got? Restream. How we doing? Looking good. Next. What's happening on it? Yes. There we go. What a science crusade. Might get to more. I've actually got a whole bunch. But hey, Twitch and YouTube and then Dex and Kick are all good. All right, hello. I like that song. All right, so I'm still experimenting with format and stuff.
Raise your fist in the air.
Yeah, raise your fists in the air. But boy, there's been a whole bunch of good videos that I've been really trying to sort out kind of which ones are the most important. But overall, I think this one right here is probably a good one. Let's do this and talk about it and pause it. And if you have any questions, this is actually, let's get that up on screen. Hey, Buttocks. This is by Side Projects, a very, very highly recommended content creator. Let's just check this out. And maybe, I should make notes. That'd be a good idea. All right, let's go.
Have you ever wondered why people act the way they do? Why do some decisions seem automatic? Or why do we sometimes say one thing but do the complete opposite? Most of us think, almost certainly incorrectly, that we've got human behavior figured out, but psychology has uncovered truths about our minds that are so counterintuitive that make you question almost everything you thought you knew about yourself and others. So let's look into some of them, shall we?
Yeah, psychology is definitely the peak behind the Matrix.
How much of what you do, say, or think daily do you believe is intentional? Most people would say almost all of it. We like to imagine ourselves as rational beings who consciously decide what to eat, how to act, and even what to feel. But actually, that's not always the case. Much of what we do is controlled by forces that we're barely aware of or not at all aware of. Take implicit bias, for example. This is the idea that we unconsciously associate certain traits with people based on race, gender, or background. And it doesn't matter how open-minded you believe you are, those biases are still there. They're very deep in your subconscious. A study titled "Does Jamal Receive a Harsher Sentence Than James? First Name Bias in the Criminal Sentencing of Black Men" examined the impact of racially stereotypical names on sentencing outcomes. Researchers analyzed sentencing data of black male inmates in Florida, correlating the distinctiveness of their first names with the severity of their sentences. They found that black men with more stereotypically black names received longer sentences compared to those with less distinctive names, even when controlling for factors like the nature of the crime and prior criminal history. And these were judges that are supposedly trained to avoid bias. In a follow-up experiment, participants assigned sentences to hypothetical defendants with either stereotypically black or white names. The results indicated that defendants with stereotypically black names were given harsher sentences, highlighting the influence of implicit biases in judicial decisions. But it's not just about prejudice. The unconscious mind also tricks us in more subtle ways. Priming is a phenomenon where subtle environmental cues can influence your behavior without you even realizing it. In one famous study, researchers left a jar of money in the corner of a room and found that people became less generous and more self-focused just because the idea of money was in their peripheral vision. They weren't
Wow.
even aware that that simple visual cue triggered self-interest related behaviors. Another example was a supermarket experiment where researchers alternated between playing French and German music in the wine section. On days when French music played, sales of French wine spiked. When German music played, German wine flew off the shelves. When asked, most customers said the music didn't influence their choices, but their actions told a very different story. These discoveries
So, subtle changes in your environment can influence change like your actions. Interesting.
show us that the unconscious mind is constantly at work, steering our decisions in ways we can't even detect. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. If so much of our behavior is shaped by factors we don't control, how much of it is truly ours? Are we really as independent as we like to think? William Blake's iconic poem Invictus ends with the famous and rousing lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Inspirational words, but how true are they? What if some of your decisions are made before you're even aware that you've made them? And this brings us to one of psychology's most famous and thought-provoking experiments. In the 1980s, a neuroscientist named Benjamin Libet tested when the brain makes decisions versus when we think we make them. He hooked people up to a machine that measures brain activity and asked them to press a button whenever they felt like it. Meanwhile, they had to note the exact moment that they pressed the button. Libet found that the brain's decision-making activity started about 300 milliseconds before the participants were even aware of their intention to press the button. In other words, their brains chose first and their conscious mind caught up afterwards. And this race
I think I would have to see the methodology, and then, but I'm assuming it's sound.
This is a really big question. If our brains decide before we do we really even have free will? Or is it more like we're passengers in a car thinking we're driving when we're really just along for the ride? Before we spiral into an existential crisis, let's clarify. Libet himself didn't think this experiment proved free will doesn't exist. He argued that while the brain might initiate actions unconsciously, we still have the ability to veto them at the last moment, a kind of free won't instead of free will, if you will. However, other studies have added even more complexity to this debate. Researchers used brain scans to predict decisions participants made up to 7 seconds before they made them.
7
Your brain knows whether you'll pick
seconds.
chocolate or vanilla before you even realize you're craving ice cream. This doesn't just challenge our sense of autonomy, it has enormous implications for how we think about morality and responsibility. If unconscious processes partly drive our actions, how much blame or credit do we really deserve for them? Philosophers and neuroscientists, they're still wrestling with this question, forcing us to look at human behavior in a completely new way. As it turns out, free will might be less free than we've always believed. Think about the last time you blamed someone's actions on their personality. Maybe you said, "Oh, that's just the way he is," or "she's always been like that." It's an easy explanation, but psychology tells us there is way more at play. Our environment often has more influence on our behavior than our personality ever could. Take the infamous Stanford prison experiment. In 1971, psychologist Philip Zimbardo set up a mock prison in the basement of Stanford University. He randomly assigned participants to either be guards or prisoners. Within days, the guards started humiliating the prisoners using psychological abuse and even physical intimidation, while the prisoners began to rebel, break down, or fully submit to the guards' authority. These were regular people, students, just like you'd see on any college campus. So what happened? Well, the environment itself transformed them. The roles, the uniforms, and the sense of power or powerlessness created a situation where people acted in a way that shocked even themselves. And this isn't just a one-off experiment. Similar patterns emerge in studies of obedience. The Milgram experiment, conducted in 1961 by psychologist Stanley Milgram, aimed to explore human obedience to authority, particularly in contexts that conflicted with personal conscience. Milgram was motivated by the Holocaust and the trial of Adolf Eichmann, a high-ranking Nazi official who claimed he was just following orders in orchestrating the extermination of millions. The experiment sought to understand whether ordinary people could commit harmful acts under authoritative pressure. Participants were instructed to deliver increasingly severe electric shocks to a learner, who was an actor, whenever they gave incorrect answers. Despite hearing cries of pain and pleas to stop, most participants continued administering shocks up to lethal levels when prompted by an authority figure wearing a lab coat and insisting, quote, "The experiment requires that you continue." The study revealed that 65% of participants obeyed commands to deliver the maximum voltage despite their visible distress. But it's not just extreme examples like this. Environmental factors shape our everyday decisions.
Let's talk about that for a little bit more. I had a sociology professor that made us actually pull that Milgram experiment apart. And there were a few things that really stood out. The first was, of course, the footage they showed is not the experiment at all. But essentially it was more like a panel, big electrical panel people were seated in front of. And how the experiment worked was someone would have an appointment with the researchers. So unknown to the person being studied, the other person was a paid actor and everything was set up. But the person being studied did not know that. So what they did was, of course, the guy arrives and then the actor arrived behind him, and they were told that there were being researching a experimental training method with using punishment for teaching people how to correctly remember something. So the idea was that they were being told that they were going to be punishing them for making mistakes. So what they did was the person being studied always, when they drew lots, they made it so that they could draw lots to make it look like the person with the short lot was being experimented on. So the person being studied always got the long straw to flip the switches, right? That's the setup. So they're showing, they bring in like the actor and the person being studied into the room with the switches to turn on the power. And the guy that's the actor asks, "How much voltage is that? I kind of got a heart condition." And the experimenter doesn't really say anything, and then he takes, gives the instructions to the person with the switches, then takes the actor into the next room, right? And then in the next room, what's been set up is a pre-recorded audio where the actor has pre-recorded on a tape the sounds of, he gets zapped for the first time and says, "Woo!" and goes on until he starts going, my chest. I gotta get out of here. Help. And I mean, he goes to the point of not responding. anymore. And so I think the 12% there in that graph was where they stopped, like most, well, 12.5% of the people stopped, even though there was a lab coat standing there going, the experiment must continue. And the interesting question in our class, we had looked at the Milgram experiment, and then my prof said, I've been teaching this for, I don't know, 18 years, something like that. And last term, I had the most profound question. And it never occurred to me, and I'll share it with you. In the Milgram experiment, did anybody refuse to administer even one shot? Interesting. They didn't have the data. Anyway, carry on.
Decisions more than we realize. The nudge theory is that small changes in our surroundings can drastically influence our choices. For example, placing healthier foods at eye level in a cafeteria can lead people to make better dietary decisions without them even noticing. This is an area of psychology that we know very little about, but it has become clear that sometimes when someone acts out a character, it's not necessarily who they are, it's where they are. Alright, now let's talk about one of the most uncomfortable truths about being human.
Oof.
We are really excellent at lying to ourselves. And no, I'm not just talking about you telling yourself you'll hit the gym tomorrow. I'm talking about the mental gymnastics we perform to justify actions or beliefs that don't align with who we think we are. This is called cognitive dissonance, and it's one of the most fascinating discoveries in psychology. When your actions and beliefs crash, your brain doesn't like it. That tension feels uncomfortable, so it works overtime to resolve the conflict. And more often than not, it does this by changing your beliefs to match your actions, rather than vice versa. Let's take a look at a classic experiment. In the 1950s, psychologist Leon Festinger asked participants to perform an incredibly boring task, turning wooden pegs on a board for an hour. Afterwards, some participants were paid $1 to tell the next group that the task was fun, while others were paid $20 to do the same thing. When asked if they actually found the task enjoyable, the $1 group was far more likely to say yes, because they had to justify lying for such a small reward. Their brains couldn't handle the inconsistency of, I told a lie for $1 and I'm not a liar. So they changed their belief to, maybe it wasn't so bad after all. This phenomenon isn't just limited to tedious tasks, it's everywhere. Think about the times you've doubled down on a bad decision, just because admitting you were wrong felt worse than sticking with it, or when you convinced yourself a purchase was worth it, even when deep down you knew it wasn't. Cognitive dissonance helps explain many aspects of human behavior, from political polarization to brand loyalty. It's why we dig in our heels during arguments, even when presented with clear evidence that we're wrong, because accepting that we made a mistake is often even harder.
Ooh. Agility of memory.
You probably think of memory as a mental filing cabinet, neatly storing all of your life experiences so that you can access them whenever necessary. But no, not quite. In fact, your memory is kind of like a messy artist, constantly editing, erasing, and redrawing parts of your past without you even realizing it. One of the most famous discoveries about memory's fragility comes from psychologist Elizabeth Loftus. She conducted a series of experiments showing how easily memories can be manipulated. In one study, participants were shown a video of a car accident and then asked questions about what they saw. Some were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. Others were asked how fast were the cars going when they hit each other. The word choice made a huge difference. Those who heard smashed estimated the cars were going faster and were more likely to remember seeing broken glass, even though there wasn't any in the video. Just a single word planted a false detail in their minds. And it gets even weirder. In another study, Loftus and her team successfully implanted entirely false memories. They asked participants to recall a childhood event that never happened, like getting lost in a shopping center. With a little suggestion and encouragement, many participants started to remember the fake event, even adding vivid details of their own. This has profound real-world implications. Eyewitness testimony, for example, is notoriously unreliable. People swear they saw a suspect at a crime scene, but what they're really recalling could be a mix of what they saw, what they were told later, and what their brain has just filled in on its own. And it's not just big, dramatic memories that are unreliable. Everyday ones can be unreliable too. Have you ever sworn you left your keys on the counter only to find them in your bag, or argued with a friend about something you both remembered differently? That is your brain at work, rewriting history in real time.
Yep. All right. Oh, the bystander effect. Yeah.
If you were walking down a busy city street with people
scary.
everywhere and someone suddenly stumbles and collapses right in front of you, what would you do? Now, most people think they'd stop and help immediately. But here's the uncomfortable truth. The majority wouldn't. This phenomenon is called the bystander effect, and it's one of psychology's most uncomfortable discoveries. It became widely known after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City. Kitty was attacked outside her apartment building, and despite her screams for help, dozens of neighbors heard but didn't intervene. This tragedy sparked widespread outrage and raised a chilling question. Why didn't anyone do anything? Psychologists John Darley and Bibb Latan decided to find out. They conducted experiments where participants believed they were overhearing someone in another room having a medical emergency. When people thought they were the only ones who could help, most took action. But their willingness to act dropped dramatically when they believed others were also listening. The more bystanders there were, the less likely anyone was to help. So, why does this happen? It's not because people are uncaring or cruel, it's psychological. First, there's the diffusion of responsibility, the assumption that someone else will step in. Then there's the social proof. We look to others to gauge how serious the situation is. If no one else acts, we hesitate, thinking it might not be an emergency after all. The bystander effect isn't just a historical or theoretical concept, it plays out daily. Think of videos on the internet where people walk past someone clearly in need, or moments when crowds witness injustices but remain silent. It's uncomfortable to admit, but any of us could fall into this trap under the right circumstances.
Scary. Scary.
Human behavior is far more intricate
What
than
happened
we
here?
often give it credit for. We
We
like
got
to believe
stabbed.
we're logical, independent, and in
Middle
full
of the
control of
street.
our choices, but the truth is, our actions are shaped by a complex web of emotions, instincts, and social influences that operate beneath the surface of our awareness. It's a fascinating reminder that we're not just rational decision makers, we're deeply influenced by context, environment, and even the people around us. What makes this so compelling is how it shifts our perspective on everyday life. Why do people freeze in emergencies? Why do we stick to beliefs even when they're proven wrong? Or why does a seemingly small act of kindness ripple into something much bigger? Human behavior is far from predictable. But when you understand these psychological factors that we've looked at, we can begin to paint a rough image of how human beings operate. But that image
Very
is
cool.
often completely different from what we imagine it to be.
Let me see here. Go. We talked about implicit bias. We associate certain traits with either race, gender, or background. And there was priming, subtle things in your environment can influence your choices. Environment determines more about your actions than you know. Cognitive dissonance. When your actions and belief clash, you change your beliefs in order to justify your actions. Oh boy. Eyewitness testimony is unreliable because your brain makes a combination of what it saw, what it thinks it saw, and whatever details it thinks needs to fill in. Bystander effect. The more bystanders there are, the less likely anyone is to help because of diffusion of responsibility. The idea that someone else will step in, and social proof. If no one else thinks it's important, it's not an emergency. So that's kind of the summary. I don't know. Do we have any questions? Concerns? No? All right. Oh, call it. We'll see you tomorrow morning. Try and get on by 6 a.m. We'll see. Have a good one. And giddy up. Hang on. You got to giddy up.
Raise your fist in the air. Raise your fist in the air. Raise your fist in the air.
Okay.
Raise your fist in the air. Raise your fist.
All right. We will see everyone